But what matters most of all is actually actions on the ground rather than just words on a piece of paper. And I think we should be very clear that Vladimir Putin needs to know that unless his behavior changes, the sanctions we have in place won't be altered.
A warning from British Prime Minister David Cameron to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Alongside Miranda Khan, J.D. Hayworth back with you on America's Forum. Miranda, the Ukraine dealt a severe blow by pro-Russian rebels. Ukrainian troops forced retreat after those rebels captured a key town.
Yeah, at least 13 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in that withdrawal, and more than 100 were wounded, plus 93 of them were taken prisoner.
Joining us for more on the ceasefire that apparently isn't, Michael Rubin from the American Enterprise Institute, a former Pentagon official whose major research areas include the Middle East, Turkey, Iran, and diplomacy. Michael Rubin's also the author of Dancing with the Devil, The Perils of Engagement. And even as we understand those perils, we are happy to announce that engaged with us for the rest of this hour, so to speak, in terms of television, Michael Patrick Flanagan, who likewise is here from Newsmax, Washington. Michael Rubin, what are you hearing about this battle in the Ukraine, and what does that mean for Russian military fortunes there and continued Russian involvement?
Well, it really simply provides clarity to Vladimir Putin's intentions. But, you know, Vladimir Putin won the second he negotiated a quote-unquote ceasefire with Angela Merkel and other European leaders. And the reason is this: sitting at the table and signing off on the ceasefire were the leaders in Minsk of the rebel provinces, which Vladimir Putin is propping up in Donetsk and Luhansk. And what that did, in effect, was give them legitimacy, give them equal role at the table. We should have seen this coming.
And Ukraine's military said, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Okay.
I apologize. Please go ahead, Miranda, please.
All right. Thank you. Ukraine's military said 80% of the Ukrainian armed forces have pulled out. So, Michael, my question to you is, what happens now?
Well, ultimately, what I think we're seeing is Vladimir Putin engaged in a multi-course meal. And sometimes when you're engaged in a multi-course meal, you got to sit back and digest a little bit. That's what I see the last week as being. I don't think by any means we've seen the end of Russian aggression in the Ukraine or Russian aggression against other neighbors.
Yeah, Michael, I think it's important we understand that the rebels, as we call them, are really Russian regulars in a large sense. These are Putin's forces trying to move through the Ukraine after their success in the Crimea. And we get hung up, I think, a little bit on the ex-president, his funding of this, and the Russian involvement in a client almost in the sense of these rebels. But it really is the Russians, isn't it, moving through the Ukraine?
It absolutely is. And the proof of this is that some Russian journalists, as well as Ukrainian journalists, have gone to Pskov, which is up near the Baltic states. And it's the Russian equivalent of Fort Bragg. It's where their special forces are. And they combed through several of the cemeteries in that city and found hundreds of fresh Russian graves of people that had been killed, special forces who had been killed fighting in the Ukraine. That belies the idea that the special forces aren't fighting under the uniforms of these so-called separatists.
It also sounds, if those are fresh graves, as if the Ukrainian army has been holding its own. But then we get the news of this military rout just yesterday to kill the ceasefire. What gives? Can the Ukrainians stand alone and defang the Russian bear?
Well, the Russian bear hasn't had as easy a time of it as perhaps they were expecting. But that said, can the Ukrainians stand up against the Russian behemoth? Unfortunately, without adequate support, the answer is no. One of the goals of the Minsk process for Vladimir Putin was simply to deflate the momentum of the West so that the United States or perhaps others wouldn't give the Ukrainian army the arms they so desperately need to push back the Russians.
That's a great observation. And is there any chance you think that Congress will sell the Ukraine the Javelin missiles and other things that they've been begging for to be able to successfully fight the Russian army?
About 15 seconds on this, Michael Rubin.
Well, ultimately, I think there is a chance, but the problem is the Pentagon bureaucracy. It takes so many months to get those weapons in place, the Russians would see exactly what was coming well ahead of time.
Michael Rubin, please stand by. Likewise, Michael Patrick Flanagan. Miranda and I will be back to continue our conversation with Messrs. Rubin and Flanagan about hotspots in the world and what it might mean for American policy, because after all, the name of this program is America's Forum. We'll be right back.
There's no question that some of the things that the Israelis have said in characterizing our negotiating position have not been accurate. There's no question about that.
Presidential Press Secretary Josh Earnest accusing Israel of leaking inaccurate information about the U.S.-Iran nuclear talks. Back now on America's Forum with Miranda Kahn, J.D. Hayworth here at the anchor desk.
Yeah, the relationship between President Obama and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seems to be deteriorating. And now several aides to Netanyahu claim they're being deliberately left in the dark when it comes to nuclear negotiations.
Doesn't sound very good. Let's continue our conversation with Michael Rubin from the American Enterprise Institute, who joins us via Skype from AEI. Also with us this morning, former Congressman Michael Patrick Flanagan at Newsmax Washington. Gentlemen, we thank you both for staying here. This whole dynamic, Michael Rubin, do you believe Israel is leaking information that is upsetting the White House?
No, I believe what the problem is that the Israelis are asking tough questions because Israel, like Saudi Arabia, like Kuwait, like the United Arab Emirates, and almost every other U.S. ally in the region, simply isn't willing to accept the White House spin at face value. The problem isn't simply that Israel isn't latching on to the White House talking points. The problem is that there's a crisis of confidence between the United States and its allies, and rather than address that crisis, the United States and the Obama administration specifically simply wants to clamp down and punish those who dare to question it.
Yeah, Michael, I couldn't agree with you more. It's the Chicago way to punish anyone who rubs you the wrong way. But Brit Hume on the television the night or the night before last advanced an interesting theory that the Obama administration was actually pursuing a bilateral agreement with Iran and thus trying to replace them with Israel, so that our best friend in the region would be the Islamic Republic rather than Israel, and that a lot of the machinations that have been going on have been directed at quiet negotiations to get that done. Do you think that has any validity? Could the administration be that deep to do that?
Well, you know, the basis of this thought is simply the letter-writing campaign, the pen pal episode, if you will, between Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and Barack Obama. When this was exposed, for example, with regard to the fight against the Islamic State cooperating with Iran, who is just as complicit in terrorism as the Islamic State is, it really shocked many of America's Arab allies, as well as Israel, because the United States said that we're going to be working with you. This is one of the reasons why there's this crisis of confidence. Is Iran a major state in the region? Yes. Does the Obama administration understand that Iran is as much a threat to security as the Islamic State is? No. Look, terrorism and the Islamic State terrorism and Sunni radicalism, we have an interest in defeating that. The Iranians have an interest in defeating that as well. But, you know, arsonists and firefighters both have interests in fires. It doesn't mean we're on the same side.
Okay, Michael, you just mentioned ISIS. Let's switch gears now to Marie Harf. She's been suggesting that there is a connection between terrorism and the economy, and that somehow jobs, or lack thereof, are fueling terrorism. What do you know about her? Well,
you know, her background, I believe, comes from the CIA. Look, I don't know her personal biography that well, but what she does reflect is the State Department and a State Department culture which finds it comforting to believe that terrorism is rooted in grievance, because if terrorism is rooted in grievance, then you can throw incentives or bribes or forced concessions under fire and terrorism goes away. But, for example, to say that the reason why the Islamic State exists is because of former Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, and if only he goes away, then the Islamic State's going to lose its misogyny and its hatred of religious minorities, that's just nonsense. That's not reality. And unfortunately, the Obama administration rather operate in a dream world than confront the cold, hard truth that this is about ideology.
Michael Rubin, author of the book Dancing with the Devil, the perils of engagement. We thank you for your insights, not only on the interaction between Israel and the United States, but also the curious pronouncements from that State Department spokeswoman. Coming up, Michael Patrick Flanagan and I will talk a little more about the Chicago way and grievances. Both of those terms came up a second ago. We'll elaborate when we come back here on America's Forum.